Welcome to Mula Matters with Ina. Today we are chatting about living annuities to Warren Wilkinson, franchise principal and financial advisor at Consult by Momentum. One of our readers, who is 82 years old, wrote to us with an interesting question. About 25 years ago, he took out 2 living annuity policies, which at the time seemed like a good idea. He says they were never told that in actual fact, they have given the companies their money and will never have access to it other than the measly monthly withdrawals of about 5,500 Rand. Now, these are his words. Since retiring, he and his wife lived off their savings, which will be depleted by the middle of 2024. And therefore, he asked to withdraw about 200,000 Rand to cover their living expenses for the future, as the 5,500 Rand they receive now will not even cover their medical aid costs, never mind their accommodation and food. He says when he contacted the companies, he was told that he cannot withdraw the money, as it is invested in a living annuity policy. He wants to know, what are they supposed to live on? What good is having the money when you're dead and buried, he asks. He does not believe that they are the only elderly people in this predicament and feels that this type of policy should never have been allowed. He says they would have been in a better position if they invested the money with a bank and paid the tax on the interest. Now they pay management fees, which are more than the tax, and now they need the money. They have no access to it. What good is it to have the money when you are dead from starvation and buried, he asks. Whoever planned this type of policy never looked at the long-term effects from an investor's point of view or needs, he says. Now, Warren, what is a living annuity?
Hi there, Ina, and hi there to all your listeners. Thanks very much for having me on your podcast. So I think to kick off with, in terms of the Pension Fund Act, a living annuity is an option that a retiree has when they retire from either their pension, provident, or retirement annuity. And typically, for a simple scenario, what would happen is if you had R1 million in your retirement annuities or pension fund, you would be eligible to a 1/3 cash lump sum subject to the SARS retirement tax table. And there's the first 550,000 Rand that is tax free. And generally people take that 1/3, call it 333,000, and then they plan to live on that for a certain period of time. And then the other 2/3, you are obliged to consider either a life annuity or a living annuity. Now, a life annuity is something that a life insurer prices for you, and they will pay you an income for the rest of your life, either escalating with inflation or just staying the same. And then a living annuity is the alternative option, where your 2/3 will go into this vehicle, and you are then able to select an income of between a minimum of 2.5% and a maximum of 17.5% per year. And it is reviewed every year. So you can decide at the outset, seeing that you're living off your 1/3 cash for a while, you only need to withdraw 2.5%, because any income that you draw out of that living annuity is taxable. So while your 2/3 sits in a living annuity, it is grows tax-free, and you are also responsible for the underlying investment performances, and so you have the discretion over time to manage your income and manage the underlying investments, which is the risk that you take when you take out a living annuity. And so the other risk that you have that has now been faced by this reader is that over a period of time, if you do not manage the underlying assets and you do not manage the relevant income draw per year on a year-by-year basis, you may find yourself running out of money. And that typically happens when you exceed the ASISA's savings and investments guideline when it comes to income draw rates, where ASISA says and that's the Association of Savings and Investments in South Africa, I beg your pardon. And
Mm-hmm.
they recommend that you don't draw more than 4% of your living annuity to ensure, or of your capital, to ensure that it lasts for the whole of your life.
So did this consumer make a bad choice 25 years ago?
Look, it is very difficult for me to comment on whether it was necessarily a bad choice. The context in terms of where they are now and where they were when he was 57 years old is not really clear. We're not quite sure whether at that time the income that he was drawing was being supplemented by him still working on a part-time basis. We find that a lot of retired individuals, in fact, the statistics say that only 4 to 5% of South Africans can afford to retire.
Yes.
So if he retired at age 57, which is relatively young, all things considered, there's quite a bit of context missing just in terms of whether he was still working, what his health was like, whether there were any additional health costs, or any other family members that they needed to help and support, which often happens. So it is difficult to judge whether the choices that he was offered at the time by either the investment company or the insurance company or an advisor, if he engaged with an advisor at the time, in the absence of context, unfortunately, I can't tell you whether it was a good or bad decision. I think just based on our experience, there's just so many other realities that one has to consider, one being longevity. So, if you're 70 today and in really good health, you've got a 90% chance of living deep into the 90s. And he mentions that he has a medical aid. So especially when you have a quality medical aid. So you've got to be mindful of, when you kick off on your retirement strategy, realistically, how long is this money going to last you based on your current set of circumstances, needs, and objectives and goals?
And that's what he should have done instead.
I think having a very, very broad and holistic discussion about the retirement strategy is critical, because unfortunately, as I said, only 4 to 5% of South Africans can afford to retire. And for the 95% of us who are in that space of having to manage our money exceptionally prudently, it is incumbent on the consumer to seek appropriate professional advice from a certified financial planner professional to ensure that the entire context of his situation is considered, that they do scenario planning, possibly through 1, 2, or 3 scenarios to indicate to the consumer or the client, if you draw at this rate, what are the tax implications? What are the life implications? And when are you likely to run out of money in scenario A, B, and C? Typically, we find that if the client does go with the ASIS's recommendation around 4%, generally they don't have enough money to still live. So they are typically drawing about 7 to 8%, and then you are eating into capital. The other comment, the person mentioned rudiment of putting their money in the bank. Absolutely not, because the bank's average return over 20 years is 7%. And if inflation is sitting at an average of 7%, you're not growing your money in real terms. So saving your money in cash or leaving your money in the bank is not a good investment strategy to protect your wealth from the long-term erosion effects of inflation, let alone the cost of living, depending on your lifestyle that you live.
Now, I read yesterday that there's 147 million people in the world who are older than 100.
Yes.
So that is definitely something to keep in mind, that you're going to live for longer than your parents did.
Absolutely. And if you consider the planning strategy that has got to be considered regarding frail care, your frail care costs can be between 15 and 75,000 rand a month, depending on the level of care and the quality of care that you are needing or that you would like to have. So that in itself, once you get to a stage where, let's say, you have got a retirement planning strategy, something like an illness event or dementia or some form of mental illness, does force you to readjust the sails, and you need to be prepared for that possibility and that eventuality, especially around the fact that the longer you live, you may be physically healthy, but the mind does tend to go in terms of the older you get. So there are those scenarios that you've also got to consider. Absolutely.
But Warren, getting back to the reader, is there really no way he can have access to his money when his cash runs out next year?
Yeah, so I touched on the two options on his 2/3 pension. So in the scenario where he may have selected a life annuity, in that case, there may have been a guarantee or not option. But in essence, if he took no guarantee, but a joint life with his spouse, they would have been secured an income for the rest of their life, hopefully escalating with inflation. The challenge with not having a guarantee, or if the guarantee runs out, that when you do pop your clogs, there is nothing left for your heirs to receive. Where in a living annuity, as much as you don't have access beyond the income draw of a maximum or minimum of 2.5% and a maximum of 17.5% per year, should you pop your clogs at some point, or when you do, you have got the privilege of nominating beneficiaries. So your heirs can have access to the capital at that time, subject to tax. But unfortunately, the Pension Fund Act does not allow you to cash in the whole amount once you are in a living annuity.
Well, you've answered so many of my questions already. Should intermediaries not explain better when they sell an annuity? You said that it's better to have different scenarios that people can use to decide.
Yes. Sorry, I missed the first part of your question, Ina.
You already
or your statement. Sorry.
Whether he would have been better in a better position if he invested the money in a bank account. And then also, will the two-part system solve this problem that the reader has?
Well, I think the two-part system was largely introduced by government to, first of all, try and protect people from themselves, because unfortunately, sadly, the majority of pension funds within the working environment are provident funds. And when you resign or you retire or you get retrenched, you've got the option to withdraw all of your pension subject to tax. And unfortunately, with the consumer being as heavily indebted as they are at present, based on the interest rate hiking cycle and where the cost of living is finding all of us post-COVID, we find that 98% of individuals withdraw their money subject to tax. So they're hurting their future retirement planning goals. And this also leads me to another comment that possibly would have needed to be considered by this reader is, we don't know when he started saving, because if he's running out of money at 84, maybe instead of starting to save at age 30, you should have started at age 25. But again, we just don't have context in terms of when he started working. When I started working, my dad said, you've got to start saving. And that was when I was 20 years old, for retirement, should I say. So, yeah, it is unfortunately unfortunate that the two-part system is really geared to protect those assets that have been saved up to a certain point in time, and then obviously beyond that sort of mark and that line in the sand, you will still have access to some assets. Sorry, it's the other way around. So saving up to that March date, I think it's 2024, 2023, you've got access to those assets still. But any saving amount post that you will not be able to touch that. And I know that also with the recent amendments that have come through, draft amendments, they may allow you to have some measure of access to some capital. But again, it's not advisable, because if you look at the overall investment strategy for an individual, you should be having different pots for different goals and different needs. So you should have cash in the bank for cash flow management. You should have short-term and medium-term investments to cater for short-term, medium needs. And then you've got your longer-term retirement planning strategy, and you should not touch that money until you are at least 65 years or older. Because retiring in any amount before that, you've got a significant amount of time to plan for deep into the 90s. And as I said, the majority of people are running out of money, especially when they start to hit a health scare later on in life.
So your message to young people in Youth Month would be save from this year on.
Absolutely. You know, the scary thing is that South Africans and Americans save less than 1% of their income. And if you compare that to the Chinese population, they save around 34 to 37% of their income. And at present, you probably find the majority of millionaires or affluent individuals in the world are the Chinese and the Indians. They are coming out of an exceptionally prudent, productive, healthy saving habit that was modeled to them by their parents, and they've got a really, really good saving ethic. And I think that's a big challenge that we have in South Africa. So we need to continue to focus on education. So a podcast like this is essential to try and stir our young children and those who start working, and our young professionals, to have a strategy, to link with a certified financial planner and start mapping out their journey. Because as we know, wealth is not a get-rich-quick scheme, right? You plant a seed today, you don't expect a flourishing tree tomorrow. You plant that seed, and eventually you'll have a tree that will bear fruit, and then you've even got to prune that tree so that it produces more fruit. And so the principle of wealth creation is not a get-rich-quick scheme. It is having a strategy, having a plan, and unfortunately, hoping is not a strategy. You know, you've got to actually put some roots down and have some good discipline around your saving habits.
Thank you, Warren. I'm sure our listeners now have more information to make better and informed choices.
You know, you're most welcome, and thanks very much for having me on your show. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.